Greetings, creatures of the night, and welcome to Season 2 of Scream Scene, the horror movie podcast where we watch every horror movie ever made in chronological order, and then we rank them from best to worst. My name's Ben.
And I'm Sarah.
Thank you so much for listening to us today.
Now, you might be going like, Season 2? Season 1 was super long then.
Yeah, just a standard 300 and some episode season 1, like all the shows do.
Well, you also might have noticed we've been on a hiatus for close to a year.
7 months.
A big part of that is my own personal burnout. I go into a bit more detail on our Patreon, so if you want the details, that's where you can go. But as it is, we are getting back in the saddle. We are having some changes. Namely, we are going to be switching to bi-weekly releases, which means every 2 weeks. And we are looking at having someone other than myself edit the podcast. You know, some minor changes, but still going to be the same old Scream Scene that you know and love.
Thank you so much for sticking with us during this hiatus. It was really not meant to be this long. We sort of wanted to take some time off as Sarah recovered from burnout. And like she said, there's a bit more about that on our Patreon. And then, that process sort of took longer than we thought it was going to. But I think it's important to reiterate, as we often do on this podcast, that mental health is important and taking care of your mental health is important, and looking at, your life and doing the things in your life in a sustainable way is important. So while it has been a while, we always, intended to come back, and we're happy to be back. We are probably going to record a few episodes and then edit them and release them a little later, record a batch kind of to have a bit of a backlog when we start, just to slowly let us get back into the swing of things. So we don't really know when this episode will come out, but the previous episode that just went out from you, the listener's point of view, was recorded back in December of 2023. We talk about watching Godzilla -1 in it. And as of this recording, it is now July 2024. And I mention this only because here at Castle Scream Scene, we are in the midst of a 2-week heat wave. It's absurd. The temperatures around here are in the mid 30s, which for our part of the world is not okay. And especially for a sustained amount of time. Again, I feel like I say this every summer on this podcast, but if you don't believe in climate change still, I have a bridge to sell you. So, we're recording this while also being very, very sweaty. It's funny, obviously in so many months, a lot can change. We've had a lot of things going on at Castle Scream Scene. My work's been very busy. Sarah's work's been very busy, but we're very excited to be back and have our audience again and be talking to you again.
And you know what the Japanese say about horror movies and summer?
Yes.
It's going to keep you cooler.
Exactly.
Gives you the chills.
Exactly. So it's perfect for this horrible heat wave that we find ourselves in. And while I want to give a huge thank you to all of the creatures of the night who have waited so patiently for new episodes, we also can give a special thanks to some folks who signed up for our Patreon during this hiatus. Special thank yous to Dylan Coop and Chris Freeberg.
Thanks, Dylan and Chris.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who stuck with the Patreon during this extended hiatus.
Yeah, it's honestly
huge.
It really, gets to my heart. My cold, dead heart.
The Patreon helps us a lot and is going to continue to help us a lot going forward. So we really appreciate your support.
So, Ben, what are we watching this week?
This week, Sarah, I am very excited because we are watching HANYEO, or The Housemaid, from 1960. And this is our first film from South Korea.
Okay.
First film from really any of the Koreas.
I think you mean either of the Koreas.
Fair.
Korea has had a very interesting history, so of course I'm going to give you some historical and cultural context. I won't go too far back because many civilizations, they have thousands of years of history. What I'm going to do is kind of take us back to the late 1800s, though. So I want you to imagine like 1880, 1890. Korea is fairly underdeveloped. It has a monarchy with King Gojong, and politically they are a tributary to China. Now, both China and Japan are wanting influence over Korea, but at this point, Japan is just starting its Meiji Restoration. So they don't really have the economic or military power to have any kind of influence. But the reason that they do want some kind of say is because Korea, especially as it leads down into the sea, is like a great jumping off point to attack Japan.
Right, yeah.
Now, as the Meiji Restoration would continue, Japan would then begin to use its military might to make moves to control Korea, leading to the Qing-Japan War in 1894, which lasted till 1895. That's between Japan and China fighting over Korea. China lost, and with Japan winning, Korea became the Korean Empire. King Gojong became Emperor Gojong. But of course, all of that empire verbiage was in name only. Korea was a protectorate of Japan and then in a few short years annexed in 1910. So now it's officially a Japanese colony. Throughout all that time, Korea still hasn't really developed as much as we've seen Japan or China. It's still very much a peasant class, very focused on agriculture. After this annexation, there was the upper class of Japanese citizens who were the majority of people in the cities, but the rest of Korea was mainly farming. With both China and Japan looking over its shoulder, there was a big push to extinguish Korean culture and language, both when it was a tributary, but it's like you see a lot of this push coming once it becomes a Japanese colony. So it became very explicit that any kind of Korean culture or language was not okay. Things like you're not allowed to speak Korean, you're not allowed to celebrate any kind of Korean cultural holidays. Then in 1919, Emperor Gojong dies, in some opinions, mysteriously, and that sparked a tipping point. Now, the Korean independent movement had kind of been gaining traction as opposition against the elimination of Korean cultural identity. But once Gojong passed, there became a tipping point for this movement known as the March 1st movement, because that's when it took place. There was a large coordinated protest movement against Japanese colonial rule. Now, unfortunately, there were mass murders of protesters. But because of this movement and this tipping point, there was a Korean provisional government set up in Shanghai and was basically a government in exile. China was happy for them to be set up in Shanghai because it would ultimately undermine Japanese rule. So China's fine with this. And this Korean provisional government was first led by a gentleman named Syngman Rhee. Now this is 1919. There's a large Korean diaspora kind of across Asia, but there is a concentration in China. And as the Korean independent movement and liberation movement kind of gained traction, the diaspora came together to create the Korean Liberation Army and would voice support of the Allies during World War II, because, of course, going against Japan. Now, while the occupation of Korea is clearly not going well for Koreans, I will admit that due to this occupation, there was a lot of infrastructure built. So transportation, communications, this was all in the goal of modernizing Korea. As I said, though, it was achieved at the expense of Korean cultural identity. The Korean language was banned. I did want to note that literacy did increase in Korea to 22% by 1945. But of course, the Korean language is banned in like being in print, being spoken. So that literacy would be literacy in the Japanese language. Now, for more about Japan's role in World War II, I think we go into it most in depth in our Godzilla episode.
I think that's fair to say, yeah.
Suffice it to say, Japan surrenders at the end of World War II. And there was a question at the UN called the Korea question about what to do with Korea because it's such a large colony. Now, if you recall with like Germany and particularly Berlin, it kind of gets split into these different states that are overseen by different countries who were the allies. So USSR, USA, etc. That was kind of what they decided to do with Korea. Korea was divided at the 38th parallel, which is kind of the latitude line, with the north being overseen by the USSR and the south being overseen by specifically the US. This division was meant to be temporary, but instead it became a proxy for the Cold War between the US and the USSR. In 1950, North Korea crossed the 38th parallel and began the Korean War, which led to massive bombing of major cities and more civilian deaths than World War II or the Vietnam War. So that's 2 to 3 million civilian deaths. Now, there is kind of a split here. There was just under 1 million civilian deaths in South Korea and 1.5 million civilian deaths in North Korea, but still devastating all around. Now, South Korea between 1945 to 48 is being overseen by the U.S. administration, but they established what's called the First Republic in 1948 with our old friend Syngman Rhee becoming president. Unfortunately, Syngman had autocratic ruling tendencies, was a bit of a dictatorship. He had severe anti-communist policies and crackdowns, which would be in favor for the U.S. administration, but it led to very extreme political repression and tight control over cultural expression. As Syngman's rule continued, a lot of laws were tightened to kind of solidify his own power. So instead of having like a certain amount of terms, he could keep being president for a long, long time. Now, I said with the Japanese occupation, there were efforts made to modernize Korea. But because of the Korean War, a lot of those infrastructures were destroyed. So Syngman is trying to bring back that modernization, bring back some of the investment in like light industries. But that would only last for so long. Fed up with Syngman's dictatorship, there was another revolution. This time it's called the April Revolution in 1960. There were mass protests and violent crackdowns. It's at this point that I want to bring another character into the story here, and his name is Chang Myon. So Chang had been Syngman's first prime minister for a short time. Some context here, Korea has both a president and a prime minister. It's very much set up kind of like France.
Yeah, that's a very common system across the world.
Mm-hmm. So he was Syngman's first prime minister for a short time. Then he kind of bounced around as an ambassador. He was the fourth vice president, so fourth in line vice president. But before we start thinking that Chang is in support of Syngman's authoritarianism, Chang advocated vocally against it. He survived an assassination attempt in 1960, and when the VP election happened and Syngman's choice was voted in by a suspicious margin against Chang, that led to these protests and contributed to the overall unrest against Syngman. Ultimately, what would cause Syngman to resign is the body of a student was found in the river, and it was clear that this person had been beaten by police due to other evidence. There were nonstop riots for over 3 days, so Syngman said, okay, I will step down, and thus entered the Second Republic, where Chang became prime minister, and we entered into a parliamentary system. Now, this is April 1960. just to kind of put, again, everything into context with where we've come from. And this movie comes out in 1960. Do you know which month?
November.
November. Okay. So with Chang coming into being prime minister, there was a push for progressivism. He and his cabinet established 5-year plans that would expand investment in heavy industries, a lot of economic growth. There was a big regression against cracking down on political and cultural expression, and ultimately a variety of dissenting voices were allowed to be heard finally. There were good things ahead until May 1961. There was a coup that was led by Park Chung-hee. Now, Park established a Supreme Council for National Reconstruction. Ironically, they used the same 5-year plans that the Second Republic put together, but decided to crack down as dictators yet again. Now, Park, his council ended in 1963 because of pressure from the U.S. He went to the U.S. and he's like trying to be buddy-buddy with the people, and they're like, "You're a dictator, go away." And so he's like, "Oh, okay, well, we'll end the council and we'll do elections." But what a surprise. He won as president and thus started the Third Republic in Korea. But where we are in terms of this movie, it's currently 1960. There are a lot of changes, a lot of trauma from the past 50 years.
Yeah.
The economy is still very shaky. In terms of classes, there have been pushes to establish a stable economy, but ultimately right now where we are, it's still majority farming. We have a student class who are like learning either at universities in Korea or are traveling to specifically the West to learn there. And then the idea is that they'll bring those ideas back to Korea. But this like no middle class, it's kind of like high up, upper class rulers and then like majority agrarian class. There's the threat of war is still extant because at this time, like there hasn't been a conclusion for the Korean War. It's still just like, we're still just looking across the room at each other angrily. As I said, there's a lot of trauma in all of this.
Yeah.
And in the Second Republic, when there was an opening of the gates for free expression of art across any kind of medium, it saw a new theme in Korean cultural expression emerge, and it's called Han. Have you heard about Han? Do you know anything about Han?
Not really.
Okay. So a lot of Han and its definition is debated, but overall, I think in broad strokes, you can say that it's a lot about sorrow, grief, resentment, loss, but not just loss of like my brother, but loss of cultural identity, of that, the loss of being divided, because you have families who are divided between North and South Korea. Art critics at this time are kind of describing it as like the beauty of sorrow. So there's a lot of sadness. There is like an element of hope in it that things will get better. But ultimately, it is about that collective trauma over the history of oppression, the cultural genocide from Japan, and that unresolved resentment against these injustices the Korean people have faced. It first comes into cultural expressions in the Second Republic. Before that, you don't really see it at all. So you can really directly tie it to the cultural experience of trauma. But I thought it was important to call out that Han and this idea of like, oh, the Koreans are so put down on and have such a hard go in life. As a national identity, this idea has been potentially popularized at home and abroad by Japan itself, both to infantilize Korea as a colony, of like, oh, they can't stand on their own, like, we gotta help them out, very paternalistic, but also to normalize the oppression in Korea, that this is just your life. Look how sad and stagnant the Korean culture is. Like, we really have to stay around and help you guys. Like, look how sad you are. This is just how your life is. But we're going to bring some modernization to you. So you can see that in the way that Japan talks about Korea, even in like their own discussions, not in Korea. So I think it's important to bring that kind of context in. But with the Second Republic, it's almost like a reclamation of this national identity. As a I'll say like a cultural trend in the arts ends up going underground a bit with the Third Republic, but it does come back, particularly in like the 70s and 80s. Today, a lot of Korean expressions of art and everything are kind of moving away from Han. It's like they're like, we don't want to be seen as sad anymore. Like we have capitalism, we have exciting economy, we have K-pop.
Yeah.
Like, look how exciting things are. It's very much more optimistic and exuberant with the asterisk of like capitalism should be critiqued. But there is that like same kind of exuberance that you see with like the I forget what it's called, but it's like the golden era that we see in Japan after the occupation of once like in the 80s, and they get like this big boost economically.
Yes.
So that is kind of where the shift happens in Korea as well. But of course, that's 20 years in the future from where we are right now.
Thank you so much for that historical, cultural, economic background. I think that's going to really help us looking at HANYEO, this film tonight.
Well, Han's in the name, right?
Right. Nothing to do with the Han that means brief. But as this is our first Korean film, I thought it would be good to talk a little bit about like the Korean film industry. So the dramatic Korean film industry began in 1919 with these things called kino dramas, which were stage plays that had a filmed backdrop. So you would go out and like film shots of the city or the forest or whatever, then rear project those for a play. The popular traditional Korean story Chunhyang-ga was the source material for Korea's first dramatic feature film. It was also their first sound film, their first color film, and their first widescreen film. Not all one film. That story is just very popular and has been remade many, 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 many times.
Okay.
As in Japan, Korean silent films utilized a narrator called a byunsa. And during the Japanese occupation, political and satirical messages could be inserted live into the film by the byunsa, even as like the base film made it past the censors. However, the occupation meant that once sound films came into play, they faced much harder censorship coming in the mid to late 1930s. One thing that's very interesting about Korean films in the silent era and in the early sound period is that they were in Korean, whether that was the title cards or what the byunsa was saying, or even like the dialogue in the early sound films, because the films were relying a lot on these traditional Korean narratives to get people into cinemas. And so it was like the movies made more money being in Korean, even though the language was banned like in day-to-day use, which I think is really interesting because the censorship was run by the Japanese. Eventually, the Japanese plan to like culturally assimilate Korea found its way into the film industry by blocking the import of European and American films and imposing heavy import of Japanese films. And so you had this rule that like Korean cinemas had to show Japanese films X many days out of the week or something like that. The end of the occupation saw a boom in like nationalistic pictures celebrating Korea's liberation.
That tracks.
Yeah, which makes
particularly
sense.
with like the US overlooking Korea, like that is in line with what they were even doing in Japan. So,
but this boom time was cut short by the Civil War, and then after the armistice, there was a heavy influx of American films into South Korea, and this sort of threatened to like overwhelm the Korean film industry. And so this, as well as a need to financially rebuild the industry, led to the government in that First Republic that you were talking about to make the decision to exempt the Korean domestic film industry from taxation as to encourage its growth and popularity. So if you're making movies, you don't have to pay taxes. This caused this huge swell of Korean films to be made, as you might expect a very large boom in South Korean film industry. For instance, the 1955 remake of Chunhyanga had an audience attendance equal to 10% of Seoul's population.
Damn.
15 films were produced in South Korea in 1954. By 1959, that number had risen to 111.
Per year?
Yes.
Holy moly.
To promote production, censorship laws were loosened. And so even though the First Republic government, as you were saying, was very like strict and authoritarian, a lot of Korean films in the 1950s sort of just like got away with whatever they wanted to because the government wanted the industry to just like be pumping stuff out and just making stuff and growing. And it became like enormously popular. You didn't really have a lot of television in Korea at this time. And so people were like going to the theaters in these huge numbers. And so all of this meant that Western themes and values were emerging in South Korean films, such as 1956's Chayubyun, or Madam Freedom. And then with the coming of the Second Republic, for that brief span of time in 1960,
just over a year,
you had this, as you mentioned, like floodgates of sort of permissibility of expression. And it is in this period that 3 major classics of Korean cinema were produced. Like, if you were to ask anyone, I would say like before 1998, what the top 3 Korean films of all time were, they were all made in this year during this brief span of the Second Republic.
Okay.
So these were the 1960 tragedy Obaltan, or Aimless Bullet, long considered the best Korean film ever made. 1961's Mabu, or The Coachman, which was the first Korean film to garner attention at international film festivals. And tonight's movie, 1960's HANYEO, or The HOUSEMAID.
Okay.
Yes, this movie's a big deal. This is one of the top 3 Korean movies ever made, at least like before, I guess, like the Korean wave, like the Korean cinematic renaissance that we sort of got starting in the 21st century that we're still kind of in. This film's auteur is Kim Ki-young, who was born in Keijo, which is modern-day Seoul, in around 1920 during the Japanese occupation. His family was an artistic one, so his parents were very much into the arts. They were very much into education. He was someone who was always going to be encouraged to go into the arts, be encouraged to pursue a higher education. And he grew up in Heijo, which is modern-day Pyongyang, which is really interesting. He sort of spent time throughout his life in both of the cities that would become the capitals of both North and South Korea.
Yeah.
Growing up, Kim showed talent in music, painting, and writing, but his main interest was in theater. After the liberation of Korea, he got into Seoul Medical School and majored in dentistry, but spent a lot of his time in the study of drama. He started a campus theater group, and there he met his wife, who acted in his productions in school. After graduation, she would become a successful dentist. Meanwhile, during the Civil War, Kim would get a job writing documentaries for the United States Information Service.
By documentaries, do you mean propaganda?
Yeah, like propaganda newsreels. Yeah. He would film about 20 such pieces, gaining valuable training and access to equipment, which he used to shoot his first feature film, the neo-realist Jugome Sanja, or Box of Death, in 1955. His second film, Yangsan-do, or Yangsan Province, was the second most successful Korean film of 1955, but was criticized for its ending, which incorporated non-realistic elements. So in the 1950s at this time, the sort of popular Korean films were ones that had rural settings and were realistic.
Yeah.
And at first, Kim's movies were very neo-realist because he came out of that like documentary tradition and he was being influenced by Italian neorealism films. And, you know, that seemed like an appropriate genre for like post-war Korea in the same way that it was appropriate for post-war Italy. Where Yang Sung-do was criticized was because the ending showed the lead characters like ascending to heaven. And critics were like, well, that's not realistic. That's like a metaphorical element. You shouldn't have metaphors in movies. So in 1956, Kim started his own production company, supported by money from his wife's dental practice.
Nice.
So she was making so much money as a dentist that she could basically bankroll him to be an independent producer, which gave him a greater degree of creative freedom compared to many of his contemporaries. And so his films began to move away from these Korean aesthetic ideals of realism, as well as like rural depictions of family life and like the, I guess, noble beauty of Han and stuff like that, and towards a much more like gritty social realism that came out of the fact that he lived in like the red light district in Seoul and like saw a lot of these like vast economic changes that were happening to Korea at this time.
Yeah.
So The Housemaid is considered to be the film in which Kim's mature style as a director became fully realized. In it, Kim would break from realism and establish a story template that he would explore again and again in future works. The key themes of Kim's work would continue to be those of gothic surrealism, horror, and perverse sexuality, all of which he establishes in HANYEO.
Okay. The moment you said gothic, I was like, hell yeah.
Now, the sort of Korean film industry on the whole suffered a downturn in the 70s and 80s, partially due to increased censorship from the government and partially due to the rise of television. And with that, so did Kim's career kind of like slip into obscurity. He kept making movies, but they sort of turned into these like B movie exploitation films, which he didn't really like mind because he just sort of kept like going deeper and deeper into this like particular niche. But it did mean that he went from being like one of the most respected directors in the country to kind of being someone no one had ever heard of.
The reverse career trajectory of Roger Corman.
It's sort of like if Orson Welles became Ed Wood, I guess, although not in terms of his films being bad, but in terms of that like slip into exploitation cinema.
Sure.
In the 1990s, Kim's films were rediscovered by like Korean internet film bros, basically. And so they started getting shown again in film festivals in Busan, and then like across the world in these like big career retrospectives. Modern South Korean directors like Park Chung-uk, who directed Old Boy and The Handmaiden, or Bong Joon-ho, who directed Parasite, have cited Kim's work and his films as like major influences on their career and films. Certainly, it's really easy to kind of draw a line from The Housemaid to Parasite.
Okay.
So Kim wrote, directed, edited, and produced The Housemaid. So like when I say he's the auteur, like I'm not exaggerating.
Mm-hmm.
The film stars Kim Ching-yu as the husband, Chu Chung-yo as the wife, and Lee Yun-shim as the housemaid. Now, Lee is said to have done such a good job as the villainous housemaid that her performance had like such a huge impact on Korean audiences at the time that it made it difficult for her to get roles as sympathetic characters afterwards. Actor Ahn Sung-gi was 9 years old when he appeared as the young son in this film. Today, he has appeared in over 130 Korean movies, is considered one of South Korea's most respected actors, and is like often referred to as like the nation's actor.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. So when Kim's career was rediscovered in the 90s, it was estimated that 90% of his films were lost. It was thought that like most Korean films before the mid 70s, in fact, were lost. And that's kind of wild. Like,
Yeah.
What do you mean? How did this happen? And the story of what happened is kind of nuts. Basically, a popular hat making corporation in Korea manufactured straw hats for farmers, and they discovered that lining the brim with celluloid made the hats sturdier, so they bought up tons and tons and tons of old 16 millimeter, 35 millimeter like distribution prints of old movies and used them to line hats.
That is wild.
Yes.
And I can't think of the worst flammable substance to line a straw hat with.
And then like chemists would like remove the silver
Yeah.
from the film to like use in other things. This all came out of like this very strong like waste not want not
Yeah.
sort of culture in Korea post-war. It meant that like a lot of films were just thought to be lost because like they turned into farmer hats. So there was a concerted effort on the part of this new generation of Korean filmmakers to recover their cinematic past and like find these old movies and try to restore them. And this was aided by the resources of foreigners like Martin Scorsese. This has led to only 31% of Kim's films being lost today.
That's not bad.
Yeah, that's a
From
real
90%
Yeah.
to 30%.
Right? We did a good job. Even The Housemaid was thought to be essentially lost. For a long time, it was never released on VHS. It just had like this reputation. And part of that reputation came from the fact that Kim remade it twice in his career later on.
Sure.
As Woman of Fire in the 1970s and as Woman of Fire 82 in 1982. But it had this like legendary status. Eventually, they discovered that because Kim financed all of his movies himself through his wife's dental business, his wife had the negatives at home, but they were missing 2 reels. And so for a long time, like the movie was missing these 2 reels. There's nothing we can do until finally they discovered the 2 reels in a print that was created for foreign export.
Okay.
The problem was that print has these really huge, obnoxious English subtitles like painted onto the film all throughout.
God damn it.
So this required a restoration team funded by Martin Scorsese's World Cinema Project to go in and like hand restore the film by like digitally removing the subtitles frame by frame. And they were doing this, but they were running out of money and they were running out of time because the restored film was supposed to play at the 2008 Cannes Film Festival. So finally, they teamed up with like some computer tech bros at like a Korean university who brought in like essentially like an adaptive learning kind of restoration program to restore the film kind of automatically. And then you could go in by hand and fix any like little problems that resulted from that. So that's how we got the restored version of HANYEO.
One good thing, thanks to AI.
Right. So HANYEO was originally released on November 3rd, 1960 in South Korea. As I said, its restoration was featured at the 2008 Cannes Film Festival. Unfortunately, Kim Gi-young died in 1998 in a house fire caused by a short circuit.
Oh dear.
So he did get to see like some of this critical reappraisal of his work in the late 90s, but not really. But his wife continues to represent his work at these retrospective screenings. The film was released by the Criterion Collection on Blu-ray and DVD as part of Martin Scorsese's World Cinema Project, and so it is available to stream on the Criterion channel.
Criterion coming through once again.
Yes.
Well, that's how we're going to be watching the movie. Hopefully, listeners, you can find a copy to watch along. You're going to hear a brief musical interlude, and when we come back, we will discuss The Housemaid from Kim Gi-young from 1960.
See you on the other side, everybody.
Welcome back to Scream Scene. We just finished watching The Housemaid from 1960, directed by Kim Ki-young. Ben, first thoughts? What did you think?
This is an insane movie. Like, it is utterly unhinged.
It's nightmarish.
It's a slow build, but once the crazy starts up, it just does not let up.
Yeah, and I think the description of it being gothic is a good way to describe the way that it has this very tense atmosphere. It has a very good controlled mood and kind of suffocating vibe to it for the characters, as well as a good way to kind of set the tone for what's going to happen.
Yeah.
Because of also like the irrational behaviors of some people.
Yeah, it's definitely very, I don't know if stylized is quite the right word, but like melodramatic in terms of the way people act.
100%. And the people here, I would say, are more like these aren't characters in the sense that these are people.
Mm.
You know, these are broad strokes of people who are like in a fable.
Yeah, yeah. And I'd love to talk about that more and sort of the implications of that after we sort of elucidate the audience on the plot a bit.
When I started off and I said that this was nightmarish, I do mean that in all sense of the word in terms of like the way that the editing has a lot of ellipses and stuff. So a lot of things happen in the movie and I'll hit on like the main points, but I'm not going to be detailing it in its minutia.
Yeah, we can't really go blow for blow. And the reason for that is like, this is a weird comparison, but the plot structure here reminds me of like an old Bugs Bunny cartoon or like a Looney Tune cartoon in general, where like Wile E. Coyote's trying to get the Roadrunner or Sylvester's trying to get the Tweety Bird, because those would be made up of these little like
Oh, the vignettes. Yeah.
where like
okay.
Sylvester has some plan to get at Tweety Bird, or the person who's annoying Bugs is annoying Bugs. And so then the character tries to achieve their goal. Things rise up to a confrontation. It doesn't go well. And then we kind of like fade out and come back, and we're back to the drawing board with like the next attempt to get the Roadrunner, or the person annoying Bugs continuing to annoy Bugs. And we kind of like repeat these different like cycles until the end of the cartoon.
Yeah, okay. Now I can see why you made this comparison. In any case, the movie begins with what I'll call a prologue. We see a family kind of sitting around reading the newspaper, and the wife is talking about this news story about this man falling in love, or at least having an affair, with the housemaid. The husband kind of makes a joke about it, like, well, why wouldn't I? She greets me when I get home. She makes all my meals. She does all of the laundry. And the wife kind of being like, don't bring this kind of talk into our house. Like, that's so rude. Then we come into the main story here. And it's the same family that we're following. We have Mr. Kim Dong-sik, his wife, who I'll just be calling Mrs. Kim, because I don't believe she ever gets really a first name. And then their two children. So Mr. Kim, he teaches music and piano at a local factory.
He's the music teacher for the like factory workers as part of like, I guess
the
like,
music club.
Yeah, like a benefits package, I guess. I just wanted to clarify that because it's not like a music teaching factory, like it's a textile factory.
Yeah. But yeah, okay. So one of his students gives him a love letter. And this doesn't really sit right with him. He's kind of like disturbed by it. So he reports it to the administration, and this person is suspended from the factory. Even though she is suspended for only 3 days, she leaves completely because of feeling very ashamed about this. And she makes it very public to the other factory workers that she is leaving because of Mr. Kim. Meanwhile, the student's friend, Cho Kyung-hee, begins to take piano lessons at Mr. Kim's house. This is when we meet his wife and his two kids. His oldest is his daughter, A-sun, who uses crutches, and then his son, Cheng-sun, who is very selfish, very, oh, I'm going to eat that before you can get to it, and then, like, is very
He's a
mean.
little shit.
He is a little shit. And more of, like, you could be like, oh, well, all, like, 6-year-olds or however old he is, all of them are dipshits. No, he's like he's the dippiest of shits. When Kyung-hee comes to meet the family to take these piano lessons, they are currently living in this very, very small apartment. And the wife talks about, yeah, we have this house in the back. We are moving to it. It's bigger. It's a 2-story house, and it's going to be really fantastic. Let's show off our wealth. Now, Mrs. Kim is very focused on showcasing this wealth, even though it's to the detriment of her own health. She's basically working herself to the bone as a seamstress while also being a stay-at-home mom, and she's also pregnant. So pushing herself so they can have the wealth to show off, but not really taking the time to enjoy it for herself. Because she's working herself to the bone, she's exhausted. So Mr. Kim asks Kyung-hee for some maid recommendations, and she brings a cleaner from the factory named Myung-suk, who smokes, is promiscuous, and is, I guess you could say in broad strokes, a quote-unquote modern woman, which is particularly emphasized because she dresses very Western, whereas Mrs. Kim dresses in a Korean kimono. I'm sure they have an actual name, but I'm not sure what it is, but very traditional garb. Now, as I said, Chang Soon is a very spoiled young boy. He's rude, stubborn, and A Soon is mean herself, but she's also very put upon by everyone in the family, constantly being told that she just needs to exercise more so she doesn't need her crutches. And it's really just because you're not using these stairs enough, and really you just need to pull yourself up by your bootstraps to get better. Mr. Kim is characterized as being very indecisive. He's a little emasculated, particularly like by his wife, but also by like everyone in the family. It's almost like he has no will of his own to do anything. He doesn't really choose to do something unless like someone else brings it to him. The only time that he really like shows any will of his own is when he first goes to the admin, and even that is very like, no, I won't do anything. Oh, okay, maybe I will.
The main thing with him that I noticed is he's like very lawful neutral in a way. Like
Okay.
he it's pointed out to him that it would be bad for this worker for him to lodge a complaint about her love letter, but he does it anyway because he believes that like that's not correct behavior. And like at home, he very much like puts his foot down about like, I'm married to my wife, like this is who I'm married to, this is my role as a husband, is to like do these things. And there are cases where like he's really harsh with his kids, especially from like a modern perspective, but he's not depicted as being like abusive or like mean to them. He's just very like, well, you broke the rules, so now this is the punishment. That was the one through line I kind of detected with him, aside from his wishy-washiness, is that he's very like, I guess like by the book almost, like principled.
Yeah. And then Myung Suk, who is the housemaid, she is very forward, very lustful, is just as mean to the kids as they are to her. But as I said, she's very forward. So she comes on to Mr. Kim very strongly, and he consistently tries to like stop that behavior.
She's like, she comes across to me as like super jealous because like she starts coming on to Mr. Kim because she's jealous of the time that like
He spends with Kyung Hee.
yeah, exactly. She wants what other people have.
Yeah. So Kyung Hee and Mr. Kim, everyone else in the factory for that matter, hear that the student who wrote that letter has committed suicide. So Mr. Kim, as representative of the factory, and Kyung Hee, who is her friend, they attend the funeral. It goes very terribly because the mom basically blames Mr. Kim for ruining this factory worker's life. That night, they head back to Mr. Kim's house, and Kyung Hee confesses to loving him instead. She was the one who pressured the other student to write the letter, but it was she who loved him all along. He rejects her and then goes to throw her out when she threatens to blackmail him with a made-up rape accusation. Now, keeping in mind, Mrs. Kim and the kids are out at this time at her parents', and the only person here is Myung Suk, who witnesses this. Kyung Hee eventually leaves, and this is when Myung Suk goes and takes her shot and seduces Mr. Kim by basically stripping in front of him because she's completely soaked from the rain. She gets pregnant from that one time, and there's a lot of guilt and blackmail and manipulation between our main characters, which end up being the three core Myung Suk, Mr. Kim, and Mrs. Kim. Eventually, Mr. Kim confesses to his wife that he cheated and also that she's pregnant, and does frame it in the way of like, it's your fault, my wife, for wanting this house. If we didn't have this house, this never would have happened.
I do want to reframe how you're talking about Mr. Kim and the maid a little bit.
Okay.
Because I don't think it's fair to say that she seduced him and he cheated on his wife with her. Because we are basically never shown through the movie, I think, a single instance suggesting that he desires her or is attracted by her. She's extremely forward and he resists her every step of the way until she puts him in a position where she's threatening to blackmail him about his student who he threw out and is more or less backing him into a corner. I sort of interpret it as that she basically raped him.
That's a very fair clarification, but I also don't know how much of if that's what the movie is trying to put forward.
I find that like I just want to make it clear that like sexual assault from like when the woman is the perpetrator can look really different from the other way around, whereas like when it's a female victim and a male perpetrator, we're used to it looking like very obvious shows of force, and it's like, oh well, she didn't hold him down and like hit him or something, and it's like that doesn't change that. Like I don't see it as like, oh, like he really wanted her and like he cheated on his wife and now he feels guilty, more that she forced him and he felt ashamed, which is like a different set of emotions, basically.
That's very fair. Yeah, I'm not sure how the movie is intending for that to be taken, but I will say at the very least, the consent is very muddled.
And also, given that the movie then has a lot of, and we'll talk about this later, but like mixed messages about whose fault this all is, I just kind of, in the context of him confessing this, and he's in this scene where he's also trying to move blame off of himself onto his wife because like, oh, if we didn't have this house, we wouldn't have needed a maid. I just wanted to kind of like be clear that this is less like her husband's some sort of like Lothario who sleeps with anyone who walks in, and more of like, well, a very different situation.
Absolutely. No, clarity is good in these sorts of things. So Mr. Kim has confessed to his wife, and his wife is like, I'll take care of it. Her way of taking care of it is telling Myung-suk to fall down the stairs to lose the baby. She does this, but then Myung-suk does blackmail about the whole situation to keep Mr. Kim to stay with her on the second floor, because she's like, I'm going to tell all of your neighbors. If I tell the factory workers, like he'll lose his job. Mrs. Kim is trying to keep the news from spreading, but also is like, I'm not staying with my husband anymore. This is disgusting. So she's back to working herself to the bone to try to make enough money that she can move out with the kids. In revenge for the lost child, Myung-suk then poisons Chang-sun with Chekhov's rat poison that gets set up multiple times through the movie. Mrs. Kim then tries to poison Myung-suk, but is found out because it's a very obvious way to try to kill someone, so the poisons have been swapped with sugar water. Kyung-hee, this piano student, she tries to come back to be like, oh no, I just want to take piano lessons again, but then gets stabbed by Myung-sun in like the shoulder, so non-lethal stab.
And if you're wondering, after she murdered their son, why didn't they call the police or anything? It's again, this blackmail idea that like, well, if you tell anyone, I'll tell people what you've been up to and it'll be a big scandal and your reputations will be ruined and all of this.
Exactly. So this is also what I mean with like nightmarish of like, there's no way out and you're getting deeper and deeper into the drain and there's like no escape either. The only escape seems to be Myung-suk convincing Mr. Kim to die together using that poison. They both take it, and as they are both dying, Mr. Kim tries to go back down the stairs to get back to his wife because in his eyes he's never going to see her again. And there's a very iconic sequence where he's like staggering down the stairs. Myung-suk is like holding onto his legs while like lying on the floor, and her head keeps getting bonked on each stair as he goes down. He makes it down and doesn't quite make it to his wife, who is like basically passed out from overwork on her sewing machine. And Mrs. Kim then like does wake up and sees them and laments like, oh, if only I hadn't wanted this house. And then we get a bookend epilogue where family at the beginning, and again, they're joking about the news. The housemaid, who is still Myung-suk, comes in, and Mrs. Kim like is basically like, no, don't worry, I'll make dinner tonight. And Mr. Kim then addresses the audience with saying basically along the lines of like, kind of joking, like, this could happen to anyone. And I want to be clear that it's not like, careful, this could happen to you, in a way that we've seen in some like Universal movies. It's very like, hey, this could happen to anyone, so be careful out there.
Yeah, it's when we come back to the frame narrative at the end, basically Mrs. Kim's conclusion from this whole story that her husband's been spinning is like, essentially men are animals, because she's like, well, why would the husband sleep with the maid? And the husband's explanation is like, because she was there, essentially. And so she's like, well, the men are no better than animals. And then when Mr. Kim addresses the viewer at the end after his wife leaves, it's like, hey, when men get old, they start looking at younger women. So, if you're out there, men in the audience, like, I know you're looking at younger women. Don't try to deny it. So, like, fucking, keep it in your pants, or else this could happen to you.
Which, because of that, it's why I'm not sure if what you're describing as a rape scene is fully intended by the filmmakers. I'm not saying that it negates it. It just means that I'm like not sure if that's exactly what they were going for.
So this is one of my biggest difficulties with this movie.
Mm-hmm.
We watched like a little interview with the director of Parasite where he was talking about this movie, and he was talking about this framing narrative where the whole movie is just kind of a hypothetical situation being told by the husband, where the wife has brought up like, how could a husband ever possibly sleep with the maid? And he's like, well, maybe it was like this. He brings it up that this framing narrative existed so as to kind of, for the same reason that like American horror movies would be like, oh, it wasn't really a vampire, it was old man McGillicuddy, or like, oh, it was all a dream, like to kind of take the bite off, because it's like, oh, this horrible situation that undermines Korean family values didn't actually happen. It's just a story. So in that way, are we supposed to take anything in that framing narrative and what the framing narrative claims the moral to be seriously, if its only purpose is to kind of like
soften the blow?
And so are we supposed to be just looking to the main narrative for what the potential like interpretation or meaning of the story is? But I find the meta text that's created by this framing narrative to be fascinating because it both is and isn't the same family.
Yeah.
Like, it's the same actors in the same roles, in the same way that like the same actor plays Captain Hook and Wendy's dad. But like, it's not something that happened to this family. As I said, it's the wife kind of asking like, how could a man cheat with the maid? And the husband answering with this story that basically could sum up its answer as like, well, what if the bitch was crazy though? Like, that's
sure.
And in the story, the family has all these problems, like money's tight, even though they're the richest family in the neighborhood, and the kids are kind of awful, and the dad is strict because he's so principled and he's so devoted to his wife and family. Like, even after the maid has kept him basically locked up in her room until he finally agrees to do the poison with her, he's like, well, now that you're dead, like, I'm going to go downstairs and die with my wife, right? Like, he's very devoted. The wife is equally devoted to her husband too. And it's as if the like meta husband is trying to show how this maid could ruin their lives through like no fault of theirs, right? Like, it's like the husband didn't do anything wrong. He was totally devoted to his wife, and the wife was totally devoted to the husband. But this maid came in and she was just totally cuckoo bananas. And that's how this happened. Even though the story does include the weird element of blame being put on the wife because she has upper class aspirations. Meanwhile, the meta husband doesn't actually seem to be as principled as the main story
because
husband.
He's like joking about it.
Yeah, like main story husband is like, I'm devoted to my wife and I would never cheat on her ever. Whereas like meta husband is like, yeah, infidelity is just natural to men. Like, all men cheat on women. That's just how men be. And his wife is like totally disgusted with him, but also doesn't really challenge that assumption. So they're the same, but not.
Yeah, it's also set in like one of the same rooms,
Hmm.
and it's clearly like still a rich family because they have things like a piano in the room and everything when like they're having this discussion. So, yeah, I think that there is something there about the meta family and how that interrelates to the story. Like even the meta family is painted with broad strokes. Like it makes sense for the story family, I
Hmm.
guess, to be these archetypes and just be like, these are like, there's not going to be any character growth. Like, it's very surface level who these people are. But then for the meta family to also be in that way.
It's interesting because, like, you brought up the Gothic stuff,
Yeah.
right? And definitely it's in line with the Gothic genre that there's all these, like, weird contrivances and coincidences and characters who don't really act like real people do. And with the meta text in mind, it's almost justified as if you imagined the husband telling the story like, and then they get this maid and she tries to, poison the family. And the wife being like, well, wait a minute. How could she poison the family? Like, wouldn't they be able to see the label? And he's like, well, what if she switched it with the other thing? Like, as if each contrivance is the husband being like, well, what if she did this? What if she did
Sure.
this?
And I do like, I like the idea of, sure, yes, this, of like this storytelling contrivance explaining the rapid shifting emotions and like motivations, particularly with Myung Suk as like kind of an instigator in
Hmm.
all of this. But also, I do like the idea of like when you read Gothic literature and
Mm.
even like capital T traditional Gothic literature, everything is this type of archetype and shifting emotions. The melodrama is dialed up to 11. And it's very cool to me that one of like Korea's first horror movies is so tied to that very like deep horror tradition of
Hmm.
gothic horror.
Hmm. It's also worth noting that like the most popular film genre in Korea at this time was just like straight melodrama. So this is very much like a perversion almost of like the kind of movies that were already popular. And I harp on this metatext idea because it really does help like contextualize the nature of the narrative, because if you just go by the narrative itself, there's a lot of blame to go around here for the awful things that happen to people, and that makes it like hard to sift out like what the film's message is, because you have all these characters who in general don't take responsibility for their own desires and emotions. You have characters who let bad situations go on for like way too long for kind of absurd reasons. I mean, the maid should have just been fired after like the first time she came on to the husband. Like, if you were a reasonable husband in this situation and it was like, hey, my maid tried to come on to me, or my maid like successfully seduced me or raped me, however you want to look at it, like the next thing that should have happened was her getting fired.
Yeah.
And they absolutely should have gone to the police after their maid killed their fucking son. And this whole idea that, like, oh, we can't do it because the scandal would maybe damage our reputation if all of these things came out, like, possibly. But in a more realistic story, I think it's way more likely that public opinion would have sided with the rich family
Yeah.
over their, like, really clearly delinquent maid. Like, the maid is positioned for her character to, like, we first meet her and she's the piano student's new roommate after the first factory worker is suspended. And it almost comes across as if the piano student like recommends her as a maid to the family
To get her out of there.
to get her out of there, because she's already kind of this like loaf who doesn't like working and is constantly bumming cigarettes and is kind of a shitty person. Put that maid on the witness stand and like a lawyer would have just destroyed her as a character witness immediately. But we're in this nightmarish melodrama with this meta text that this story is basically the outlining of the nightmare hypothetical situation for this family, the worst that things could possibly be.
I agree with like, okay, we're going to turn the most popular genre of melodrama on its head and be like, you are stuck in this and this is how bad it can get.
Hmm.
But I also, because I did all of this historical research, I
Yeah.
kept thinking about the paternalistic state that Korea was put in,
Mm.
whether from China or from Japan, and not having,
Or their own military dictators.
sure,
Yeah.
but like what I'm trying to say is that like they're trying to stand on their own feet. They might have these aspirations to get up to the second floor, to be the richest family in the neighborhood, but is that really what's good for you right now? Like, what do you actually need right now? Do you need to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, or do you need a more understanding family when you're using crutches around the house? I don't know if this is like me reading too far into it, but I think that there is something there that the director is trying to say about like, it's not that ambition is bad, it's just if it blinds you to anything else going on in your life to the point where you like turn a blind eye or even instigate some of these like bad things of like convincing someone to jump off the second story to lose their baby, like it's ambition to the point where it blinds you is not good.
Yeah, like within the narrative,
Mhm.
none of the characters are good people.
No,
Like the husband, as you said, is like very wishy-washy and kind of is just like doesn't have the backbone to do what needs to be done. The wife is sympathetic, but like you said, she's the one who convinces the maid to throw herself down the stairs to induce a miscarriage. The daughter's sympathetic because she has the crutches, but like she's kind of a nasty brat as well. The son is sympathetic because he gets fucking murdered, but like he's a terrible person. The piano student is like fairly nice and sweet and innocent, except for the fact that she tries to like throw herself at a married man, and when he says no, like threatens to blackmail him with like a false rape accusation. Like none of these people are good people.
Yeah.
Which of course is like a key thing for it as a horror movie, so that it's justified in having terrible things happen to all of them. But I do agree with you on your point about like what the movie's trying to say about ambition, because it was really hard for me to try and figure out what the movie was trying to say, like what the message was, because it presented these different morals, like the way that the narrative is almost trying to present its moral as like, oh, if only she hadn't wanted this house, like this almost like anti-consumerist message. But then the meta narrative is trying to present this moral of like dudes are terrible, or you know, like this kind of like you can't
It's just
trust
part
men.
of like men's nature.
Yeah, and so you can't trust men and like whatever.
Which isn't good in and of itself.
Right. And it's like, what is it actually trying to say? And when I tried to find, and you know, if you consider that the narrative is just a story being told by the meta husband, and then like those characters are coming to conclusions on their own that don't really match what's being said in the narrative in terms of what, like, because again, the husband's trying to act as if it's like, oh, you know, it's the problem of men coming on to young women, but like the meta, like the narrative husband doesn't come
do
on
any of that
to the maid, right? So I was trying to like figure it out, and I think the closest thing I can think of to like a consistent thing that this movie's trying to say is very much what you were saying, specifically as don't let your reach exceed your grasp. Like know your limits in a way. Like, you know, these people have like a big second story house, and like we know that that's really extravagant for Korea at this period. But in order to do it, like he is so reliant on this job at the factory that like all of their fears are based around him losing it. And the wife, as you've said, like is working herself to the bone as a seamstress. So like it's not actually sustainable for them. The piano student wants this married man. The maid wants this whole life that isn't hers, you know, with the husband and the child and the house and everything. Like it's all these people who want stuff they can't have that's leading them to this bad end. That to me feels like the most consistent thing, more than just like women are materialists and men are, you know, men be fucking. Like
I do really think it's interesting what this movie does with depicting female desire, whether that's with both the piano student and Myung Suk lusting after Mr. Kim, but then also like Mrs. Kim herself having these desires for a larger house and being seen as like, oh, the best person in the neighborhood.
Or even her desire for her husband. Like, I thought it was a really refreshing scene that, like, there's a moment where they're in bed talking about things, and she basically tries to, like, get him in the mood for sex, and he's like, I'm tired. Because I feel like we see that scene a lot with the genders flipped.
Yeah. And so it's really interesting how, like, not only is female desire like the core of the narrative, but it's also what is the main driver of the plot. I think that's like part of why the husband seems so wishy-washy and indecisive.
Mm.
Unfortunately, it does mean that the movie does fall a little bit into that Madonna horror dichotomy between Mrs. Kim and the maid. I don't think that that's like carte blanche, this is a bad movie. I just feel like it's, no value judgment, but it's here.
I think it's like a little bit balanced.
Yeah, because of the like everyone's kind of
Everyone's kind of
it's
terrible.
not like the what David Holm
Right.
and like the nurse who's like golden put on a pedestal kind of situation.
The only everyone's kind of shitty in this movie, and like the only thing is that, like, again, to me the story makes the most sense as this what if scenario that the husband is telling his wife about, because like Mr. Kim, his worst aspect as a character is just that, like, oh, everyone forced me into doing these things.
Mhm.
I couldn't stand up for myself, right? But like the maid has no redeeming qualities really, but all the other women are at turns good and bad.
Yeah. So it's also interesting how Myung Suk is seen as like the most modern of the women in terms of like her dress and the way she behaves. She's smoking all the time, the way she speaks. To be clear, when I say modern, I do mean like this movie characterizes modern as Western.
Yes.
So she's a very westernized woman. So I think it's interesting that it's like she is like the person with no redeeming qualities.
There's a lot of times where she tries to make herself sympathetic to everyone. Like she starts crying and throws herself down at people's legs and begs for forgiveness or pity or mercy or whatever. And I was curious if you thought the movie itself was trying to get the audience to ever feel sympathetic with her, or if we were always supposed to read that as like her being manipulative.
So the only times that I found her sympathetic is when she is recovering from losing the baby. Because the doctor keeps having to come because she keeps having internal bleeding. She is grieving, and part of that grief is anger, rightfully so, because she was told to do it. It's not that she's not at fault, but like it's a very complex situation. And that's when she's her most sympathetic. But all of the other times that she is like crying or anything like that, it feels incredibly manipulative. Especially because like she'll go from being like, no, Mr. Like she doesn't just say Mr. Kim, but they say darling a lot. No, darling, like you can't leave me. You can't go back to your wife. Like I'll be up here all alone and it's cold and they haven't fed me in 3 days. And then the next scene is her stabbing the piano student for saying Mr. Kim.
Yeah.
So like all of that feels very manipulative.
With all that in mind, like, I think you're the person best suited to answer this question, because the thing that I struggled with this movie is, like, it's certainly gothic melodrama. And I've heard it referred to as domestic horror. And it's certainly a horrific situation that the family finds themselves in. But is this a horror movie in terms of, like, its genre and what we consider horror for, like, the purpose of this podcast?
I think the fact that everyone points to this as like the first horror movie from Korea makes it a horror movie, because everyone is seeing it as horror. Whether or not, like, if we were to compare this to what else came out in 1960?
Psycho.
Like, if we were to compare it to Psycho, if we were to compare it to Peeping Tom, like, no, this is not a horror movie. But fucking Korea's like just figuring their shit out. They've had a lot of shit going on. Like, I think this works to be characterized as a horror movie. I also do want to say, like, this movie gets built up a lot and a lot and a lot in interviews about the movie with current day directors, all of that. And I do want to say that unfortunately deflated the movie for me.
Mm-hmm.
Didn't have the impact that I think it could have had because of that. And I like to call that the Citizen Kane effect.
Right.
Because everyone's like, oh, Citizen Kane, the best movie ever. Yet when you show it to film students, they're like, why the fuck is this important? Because it created such a wave of like a new way of filmmaking and a new way of narrative, of having a complex main character that like you don't realize how groundbreaking it was at the time.
Yeah, it's that case where its reputation is working against it. Like Citizen Kane is actually a very fun and enjoyable movie if you aren't looking at it as homework.
That too. But like this movie, like without the context of like all of the other movies coming out, or like these melodramas, without the context of like showing desire wasn't really allowed in this great wide range, and depth wasn't really a thing in movies. And then also with like movies, even if you were to just call this a thriller, they're clearly not really being a thriller before this. I think I'll point to like why people point to this movie and say this changed everything.
Yeah, I mean it's sort of a argument in favor for the concept of this podcast, right? That like you kind of with some of these films need to understand the context to understand why they're significant, right? And I don't think this is a thriller because I don't necessarily think the movie's ever trying to get you on the edge of your seat about anything here. It's more like a death march.
It's, yeah, I guess by thriller, I also mean like a film noir.
Sure.
Right? Like,
which it has like kind of the feelings of because the maid is very femme fatale.
Yeah. And of course, horror and film noir have very similar visual aesthetics.
They have the same DNA. They're like brothers.
We haven't really touched on it, but like the cinematography is really impressive, particularly like the way that they handle moments on like the second floor. The mise en scène is really interesting to me, the way that everything is blocked, the way that every room has doors and yet nothing feels private. The lighting, all of it feels very interesting, and I think is also speaking to why this movie feels different from other movies at this time, because like clearly this like visually gave quite an impact.
Oh yeah, on a technical level, this is really an excellent film. Everything feels very tightly controlled.
Yes.
All of the things that you've mentioned are like standout. Like you watch this movie and you think about the blocking, you think about the lighting, like you notice all of these things. Especially, I think the whole movie is designed around this fantastic set they built to represent the house. Like, and you can tell like they must have built the whole house as a set, because all of the ways that the movie is shot is so specific for how all these rooms connect to one another, how the camera can move from one to the other, how you can see from one room to the other depending on where you are. It's all so very clearly planned precisely.
And because of that precision, it also leads to that fantastic maintenance of mood and tension and that feeling of being trapped and that nightmarish melodrama description that we keep pointing to.
Absolutely.
Because like the nightmare also kind of like helped explain like, well, why are we suddenly doing this when we were suddenly just doing that? And like the very like vignette nature of the editing is just like, yeah, you have no control in a nightmare. You are the passive Mr. Kim because you're not going to be able to do anything and everything's just happening around you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Do you have anything else you want to talk about with this film, or do you want to move into ranking?
I do just want to say, like, I probably should have mentioned this when talking about the house itself and being like, oh, second floor and all this, but the changing like culture and socioeconomic classes were also like very clearly given in all of the costuming and the fashions, and like what the kids were wearing, what Mr. Kim was wearing versus what Mrs. Kim was wearing, because those three get out of the house. Mrs. Kim doesn't leave the house. And even comparing what Kyung Hee is wearing as like a young woman who works at a factory
Mhm.
to Ming Suk to like characterize like one is clearly more Western than the other, but Kyung Hee also is wearing like a very like 1950s style dress.
Yeah, she's wearing like a skirt and a blouse and looks like a teeny bopper from a 50s high school movie or something. And the housemaid is dressed in like slinky black femme fatale outfits.
So it's because of the consistent use of fashion to show where people are at in a socioeconomic situation or status and how those things are changing and
Mhm.
all of that. That's why I think like the movie is saying something about Korea's status. But no, that's all I have to say.
Yeah, it's definitely a movie with a lot to think about and talk about. But when you're watching it, the experience is kind of like, oh my God, this just keeps happening.
It does feel long
Yeah.
because of the vignette style. I think maybe it is on like the longer side in the sense that it's not an hour.
I think that like some of the vignettes could have been cut. I think the movie hits like a rising action of like how extreme you think it can get way earlier in its runtime than you think it's going to. Like it keeps going after the son gets killed for way longer than I was expecting. Almost like, like a piano note trying to be sustained for too long.
And you're just pushing the pedal, being like, please keep going.
Yeah. So I do think it's a bit to get through when you're watching it, but it does leave you with a lot of interesting things to talk about afterwards.
Yeah. So since we both agree that this is a horror movie, let's move on to ranking.
Absolutely.
So where were you looking, Ben?
So I really struggled because I can tell that this is a really important movie. It's very well made on a technical level. It's really excellent. It has a lot that it's trying to say. It's a really intense experience, but I also did find it a little bit of a difficult watch. If you sat down an average horror fan in front of this and you were like, this is a horror movie, like, is it though? Or is it like a really intense soap opera? Because of that, it kind of falls into that weird, like, good movie, but is it a good horror movie kind of like crack that things fall into sometimes? So I looked on the list for like other stuff that felt really melodramatic. And the two kind of reference points I found, one was the 1941 remake of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which is at 101, which like couldn't explicitly show you anything, so it had to get across all of its emotions in like hysterical performances and weird dream sequences. Right above that is E Vampiri, and I kind of made that my ceiling.
Okay.
And then I looked down from there, and the other big melodramatic film was The Bad Seed at 111 with the evil daughter, which is like so melodramatic that it kind of pushes into camp.
Yeah, I was also drawn to The Bad Seed. The Bad Seed was originally a play, and I think you could easily adapt The Housemaid to be a play.
Easily, yeah. And The Bad Seed also, when watching it, had that feeling of like, how much longer can this go on? But I think that HANYEO, the housemaid, is better than The Bad Seed because it's saying something about like Korean society, and it has more to say and more going on than just like, what if girl, but evil though?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I looked up from The Bad Seed, and we have like Not of This Earth, which is like the Corman movie with the guy with the briefcase. And then like above that is like The Manster.
The Manster, he changes. It's like an American in Japan.
Yes.
And he changes. That movie was like surprisingly
way better than you think a movie called The Manster is going to be.
Yeah. And did have quite a bit to say in terms of, I think, like is this art though? I feel like
the answer is no.
I
on The Manster.
I feel like The Housemaid has more claim to art and I was going to say literature, but you know what I mean, like film.
Yes, yeah, I get you.
The Manster.
Cinema.
Cinema.
Above The Manster is The Black Room, which is, I always bring up, is like really intricately plotted and like just feels like a nice like clockwork kind of movie. So that's kind of my range, either the highest 101 and the lowest 109. In this range, we have other really weird melodramatic movies like Freaks,
Mm.
for instance, is kind of one that my eye goes to. What do you think about this range? Do you think this is kind of the right range, or do you think we should be looking higher or lower?
I do like this range. I do like using Eve and Puri as a waypoint because that was it's been a while, but that was like the first horror movie from Istanbul or
Italy.
I was close in terms of letters in the country name. But it also had like interesting things to say.
It was kind of structured as like a mystery.
Yeah. And then, of course, Son of Dracula, very, very gothic. Not a great Dracula movie, but it is a good vampire Southern Gothic.
Yeah, very, very good Southern Gothic for sure. Revenge of Frankenstein is the second one, where he has to escape to like London at the end, and he keeps like faking his death.
Oh, yes. Yes.
And the monster's kind of really secondary to the plot. It's like the kind of like hunchbacked guy who he like tries to make, normal or whatever, and then he kind of goes monstrous.
Yeah, kind of harping on that same old theme of Frankenstein. I am going to suggest below Freaks, but above Revenge of Frankenstein. And mainly because Freaks also, you could make the argument that it's not a horror movie because of like, a bit of a soap opera, love triangle vibe in the middle. I think, like, obviously I'm very biased as a Westerner, but Freaks is very noteworthy, in potentially the same way that The Housemaid is like noteworthy as like a piece of cinema. So I'm going to suggest that.
Yeah, I think that feels about right to me.
Yeah.
Okay, so entering the list at the new number 104, below Freaks and above the Revenge of Frankenstein, we have HANYEO from 1960, directed by Kim Gi-young.
If you would like to see this list, you can go to our website, screamscenepodcast.com. There you can find links to all of the previous episodes, as well as our appeals box. If you would like to contest this or any other ranking, you can drop us a line there. You can reach out over email at screamscenepodcast@gmail.com or send us a message through our Patreon.
Scream Scene updates every other Wednesday, and you can find us online at most podcasting apps. YouTube Podcasts has replaced Google Podcasts. I'm pretty sure Apple Podcasts is still around. We're definitely on Spotify, and we're certainly on SoundCloud. There's an RSS feed as well if you want to just subscribe that way and get the episodes no matter what happens. And of course, you can subscribe to our Patreon at patreon.com/screamscenepodcast, where you can become a patron of the night for free, but at $1 a month, you will get thanked in an episode. At $5 a month, you get access to our archives of bonus audio. And at $10 a month, there's all kinds of like above and beyond extra stuff, essays and reviews and special bonus episodes from the past and music and all kinds of goodies. And that whole archive is available to you if you subscribe at patreon.com/screamscenepodcast.
So, Ben, what are we watching next week?
Well, Sarah, we're back to Italy. We're with a movie that seems like it might be sort of a more risque ripoff of The Vampire and the Ballerina.
Okay.
It's L'ultima preda del vampiro, aka The Playgirls and the Vampire.
I will say, like, The Vampire and the Ballerina was dope, so maybe this will be dope as well.
We'll find out next week, Creatures of the Night.
Bye.
Bye.